I'm Sabina Vaught, Director of the Kinloch Commons for Critical Pedagogy and Leadership at the University of Pittsburgh. Welcome to the Digital Freedom Leadership Project. This project consists of a series of brief conversations with leaders reflecting on one of their guiding principles. The project is designed as a resource to support educational leaders doing freedom work everywhere. Joining today for a conversation about one of his leadership principles is Dr. Silas Pinto. Dr. Pinto serves as the inaugural Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging for the City of Providence, Rhode Island. His recent leadership roles include Director of the School Psychology Program and Co-Director of the Diversity and Inclusion Leadership Program at Tufts University. He directed a martial arts and cultural center focusing on wellness and impacts of intergenerational trauma in Rhode Island for 22 years. Dr. Pinto, thank you for joining me in conversation today as part of the Digital Freedom Leadership Project.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm absolutely honored that you invited me.
I'm excited to learn from you and for our conversation. So I'll start by asking you to share just one of your leadership principles and to describe its origin. So to reflect for those watching and listening about where that principle came from, how you learned it, and how and why you chose to develop that particular principle.
So that was quite the challenge when you sent the text and said, we're going to talk about one. And I was like, oh, so I literally spent a day or so trying to comb through what's the thing that's been really guiding much of my work. And I came to convening. In terms of where it started, like the idea behind convening, the bringing together of people that are often way smarter than me, way more capable, have skills, people that have expertise in their areas that are often just right under the radar for whatever reason, often because people have their own notions of what leadership is, whether they're imagining that person in the front line telling people what to do, or the person that's all the way in the back just shoving people into action, but often missing the folks that are remaining quiet. They're bringing in life experiences, work experience, and then just not being valued because they don't have the paper, for example. In terms of where it's coming from, I grew up in West Africa in the Cape Verdean Islands off the west coast of Senegal. And it gained its independence in 1975 from the Portuguese Empire. So it's a relatively young country. And as soon as we gained independence, we really started to revisit some of the teachings of folks that had been revolutionary in practice, like Amilcar Cabral, who was born in Guinea-Bissau of Cape Verdean descent and was one of the liberators of the country, who had also studied people like Frantz Fanon. And they always said, you can't do this work alone. No one person in this room is going to know what to do about everything. You have to bring people together. And that was a revolutionary idea, especially when you're pushing against empires, who was always sort of this top-down thing. And Amilcar also mentioned that it's not just a bottom-up thing. There's experience at all levels of this thing that we call leadership. And it's really going to come down to who do you bring to the table? My grandmother echoed those sentiments, and she had a kindergarten education. I always think of her as one of the wisest people I knew, because she didn't have the Portuguese Empire curriculum to be fighting against it. I remember her fighting with my mom constantly, who went through her entire K-12 experience under Portuguese rule that told her that the Cape Verdean, the more nuanced, the indigenous ways of thinking was not as important. And so I think I gravitated towards that because it was a way of finding myself and connecting to some of those roots. It also just made sense that when you bring people that have that expertise to the table, you're going to have opportunities for synergy. And that's really what that convening is about.
Wow, I love what you were able to, you always do this, connect when you talk, sort of the vast impact and process of empire and anti-imperial, anti-colonial work, revolutionary work, Cabral, Fanon, and your family, your grandmother, your mother, and then people sort of just, and always, you're always inviting us to just think about people, that everybody's contributing. The back of the room, I think you said. So I just am always appreciating how I think you said synergy, you sort of synergistically bring together all those levels and layers of work, and I'm appreciating this principle of convening, that's how you get to that. You're convening in your mind right now. So thank you. I'm always excited when I talk with you. So the next question is to share with viewers and listeners an example of when you've put the principle of convening, as you described it, into action, when you applied it, so they can hear that story and sort of observe one way that convening might work.
Absolutely. And I also want to just highlight and elaborate on the fact that I've been also in the receiving end of folks like yourself that have pulled me into spaces because you saw the value of a particular area of expertise or passion. And so I've been in moments where people have pulled me into spaces and you're like, wow, this is a very different kind of leadership and a very different kind of process than that director or the chair that was like, you do this and you do that and you do this and you do that. And sometimes it's not even connected to what you feel you can bring to the table. So it's on both ends. As I stepped into this role here in Providence as director of an inaugural department, it felt like that was the perfect sort of situation. I found myself thinking, well, this is exactly when we get to put those practices right here, land a helicopter in Providence. And so you have a department that's never existed. It's the newest department in the city. The next youngest, I believe, is 11 years old. You have people in the community that you have been working with for decades, mentors, people that have brought so many things in so many different ways to different spaces and have, again, created just that just compounded the kinds of outcomes you were expecting. And I thought, this is where we're going to do it. And so this has been the process of what we call the strategic work plan in Providence for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Bringing people together was the best way of starting that process. And right now we're about midway, if you will, because we're not even a year into the department. So the first thing I did was reach out to community leaders, identify people that were willing to have that conversation, then ask them who else needs to be at the table. Then looking around after our first meeting saying, who else should be here, who's not here, what voices are missing. We were able to identify those sectors that were really important to the city, like K-12, higher education, corporate, nonprofit, government. And then we said, hey, we don't see any youth voices here. We need to bring those organizations to the table. So we spent quite a bit of time just talking about how do we convene? What does that mean? Why are we doing it this way? Why isn't Silas just doing research on what other cities have done and then just say, this is what the city has to do? Instead, we had to really slow it down and really think about some of those principles, usually like, I'll just label it like white supremacy kind of principles that prioritize speed and who's here at the top and all of these components. And we put it on a table and we said, this is what we need to talk about first. Does this even make sense for us? Is this approach working for folks or not? And it revolutionized, I think, the way that Providence has done business in the past when it established departments. Because what we saw were people bringing in ideas we would have never thought, certainly I wouldn't have thought about it by myself. So I had to slow down, bring in the different cultures and allow people to really bring their real lived experiences into that space in authentic ways. And the convening or the leading by convening is an actual sort of framework, right, that people have been using for quite some time. I'm in education as a school psychologist, and I remember after the 2004 Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in particular, people started really talking about how do we change the way that we have been doing business and making decisions. We need to bring parents to the table in a much more authentic way. in a much more intentional way. We need to make sure that children that are going to be impacted are invited to the table. And by the 2010s, 2012, 13, people were really trying to put this piece together and identified a few things like collaborative problem solving, right? Doing it together, trying to bring people together around some shared set of issues and triumphs, right? Things that have been working well for them and things that they need. And then making sure that that process was authentic and really using skills like listening skills to really get to the nuances of people have been wanting to say, but haven't been practicing because they've never had the opportunity to actually do that. And speaking and sharing is a skill. And if you've been silenced for your whole life, you don't come into a space and then expect everything to be polished and beautiful. It actually takes some time. You have to be willing to look beyond that initial impact. People come together and like, oh, you're giving me a voice? What do I say? And it's going to be clunky at first, but when you give it that space and you push yourself out of that space and just let them talk about things, people become motivated to start sharing, and then their real selves start talking without sanctioning or thinking that they have to express in a particular way, and then it's just magic. So for me, that is a most recent example I can provide, was bringing folks together to think about a strategic vision for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging for the city of Providence by looking at the stakeholders across the different districts, across different positions and sectors, and making sure that it wasn't a one-time thing. And we've met frequently. We have a DEI collaborative that we created. And then once I don't know if I got enough of it, but once I felt like, okay, I think we have a good amount of information to try to consolidate, I wrote what I call the DEI engagement report before even thinking about a DEI strategic planning. But the purpose of that was to say, okay, folks, we had a lot of conversations. I'm talking about thousands of employees. I'm talking about thousands of residents, hundreds of meetings with individuals and groups and roundtables. And so then I had to pull it together and say, I'm going to try to pull a draft together. And then we're going to meet again. You're going to read it and then tell me if I'm actually reflecting what we have talked about collectively. And we had that meeting in November, and it was really beautiful because the range of folks that came into that space, from police department to arts, culture, and tourism and sustainability and community leaders, was unlike anything I had seen here in Providence. So it gave me a little hint that perhaps that particular approach really does work, because now people see themselves reflected in the work and they can see themselves diving into the work in a much more meaningful way and not just coming in to agree to what I have to say.
And I imagine people listening are really going to appreciate your description of the time it takes, so that listening to people or engaging people isn't about inviting people in for a 1-hour meeting and it's done, but that it's a long-term relational commitment, so that convening isn't a convention, but it's a principle of relationships that endure through a leadership tenure. And so I'm really excited that you incorporated that into your description of convening, and really appreciating the listening and I think you said, it's clunky because if people aren't accustomed to communicating their needs, their knowledges in white supremacy, in coloniality, it is clunky. And I think people will appreciate your framing of that as well.
And if you come into the space expecting that it will just be nice and smooth, and that's your frame for deciding whether or not something is valid, and you bring your own idea of what validity is, then what's the point of bringing people together to begin with? It's really about giving into that process and affirming people for what they are sharing, and then finding ways collectively to think about the next step.
Thank you for sharing your principle of convening, and for telling multiple stories and sharing instructive experiences you've had throughout your life. Really appreciate this conversation and thank you for participating in the project.
Oh, my absolute pleasure. And I couldn't think of a better convener than the person I'm talking to right now. In this very project, I think is an example of that, right? Giving people different opportunities to see and hear from different folks. And people are going to approach it linearly, some very sort of very multi-layered and dimensional.
Mm.
And they're all like really valid ways of thinking about leadership.
Yeah.
And it's an active resistance, right, against some of those typical notions of what it means to be a leader in this environment. I just love the way that this work has been going. And centering convening has really changed the way that I've thought about convening over time.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's
Most
always wonderful to see you.
likewise.